New Zealand is one of the most isolated countries in the world. As such, it doesn't come as a surprise that nearly 80% of the country's land is completely uninhabited. The country has a population of just 4.9 million, which is kind of weird when you think about it. New Zealand is huge and has a very good climate for people to live in. The South Island and the North Island are respectively the 12th and 14th largest islands in the world. These two main islands put together are larger than the United Kingdom, and just like the UK, they share an almost ideal climate with very similar temperatures throughout the year. But despite this, New Zealand is vastly less populated than the UK, so why is this country at the end of the world which is rich in flora and fauna and a stable climate so empty? Let's find out in today's video. The vast majority of New Zealand's population, more than 3/4 of them, all live clustered together on the North Island, while less than a quarter of them live much more spread out across the geographically larger South Island. The smaller North Island, therefore, has a lot more people than the South Island does, but even then, almost half of all of the North Islanders live just around the primary city of Auckland. This is by far the biggest city in the country. It's strategically located along an isthmus with good natural harbours to the north and to the south, and placed over a dormant volcanic field with fertile soil. Auckland alone is home to some 37% of all modern New Zealanders and is fast approaching a population of 2 million people. This high concentration of people just around one city makes New Zealand one of the most highly centralised countries anywhere in the developed world. Now, the biggest and most obvious factor explaining New Zealand's relative emptiness is simply its sheer isolation away from the rest of the world. The closest other larger landmass is of course Australia, but they are separated by nearly 2,000 kilometres across the Tasman Sea. Other than that, it's all just scattered islands, Antarctica, open empty oceans for thousands of kilometres in every single direction. Even today, because there's simply nothing to do down here, air and maritime traffic around the South Pacific is the most empty spot on the globe. It takes a nearly 4-hour flight just to hop between Auckland and Sydney, which is roughly comparable to a flight between London and Athens across the whole of Europe. And that's just New Zealand's closest neighbour. For most of Europe, New Zealand is quite literally the farthest place away they can get without leaving the planet itself. New Zealand's isolation also meant it was always fated to become the final large habitable landmass on the Earth's surface ever to be discovered by humans. It remained perfectly untouched by humans throughout all of history and civilization until a group of Polynesian explorers happened to stumble upon it by mere chance, sometime during the 13th century. From there, over centuries, the initial Polynesian settlers developed a unique culture of their own, the Maori. They remained undisturbed from the outside world until the mid-17th century when a Dutch sailor became the first non-Polynesian to ever discover and visit them. But sustained and lasting European contact with the islands didn't begin later until 1769, when the British sailor Captain James Cook visited the islands nearly 5 centuries after the Maori had first discovered and settled them. Modern demographers usually estimate the Maori population in New Zealand likely numbered around 200,000 individuals after 5 centuries of living there by the time the British arrived. Subsequently, their population began to crash significantly, and by 1840, the British Empire formally incorporated New Zealand into a colonial possession. Soon after, a flood of immigrants arrived on the islands coming from Britain and Ireland. Through a combination of various factors like European introduced diseases that the Maori lacked any immunities to, warfare and violence between the colonisers and the indigenous Maori, and the forced introduction of a brand new legal and justice system that was unfamiliar to them, the Maori population in New Zealand plummeted from around 200,000 at the time of contact in 1769 to only around 40,000 more than a century later in 1890. By that point, around 500,000 white European colonists had arrived on the islands and mostly replaced them. Now, initially during the colonisation process, most of the new European settlers who came decided to set up shop on the South Island because the North Island was a lot more inhabited by the indigenous Maori. Over the years, the North Island has seen tremendous population growth because it was always destined to happen. So why did all the European settlers decide to move up to the North Island instead of building cities in the south? It turns out the South Island is pretty difficult to build any civilization on. For starters, the South Island is significantly more mountainous than the North Island. This is because beneath the surface, New Zealand exists precisely along the intersection of the Pacific and Australian tectonic plates. But beneath the South Island, the westward moving Pacific plate is crashing into and subducting beneath the northwest moving Australian plate. Over the past 45 million years, the collision of these two plates has thrust up to 20 kilometers worth of rock to form the Southern Alps running along nearly the entire length of the South Island. 18 peaks in this range exceed 3,000 meters in elevation, while the tallest of them stands at more than 3,700 meters and is nearly as high as the iconic Mount Fuji in Japan. Economically developing humongous mountains is a challenging task because building anything around them or through them is just more expensive and labor-intensive than it is on more ideal flatter lands. But taking up a lot of otherwise available little space on the South Island isn't the only problem to development that the mountains here pose. They extend for about 500 kilometers across the whole island and carve out only a narrow strip of land to their west that is exposed to the prevailing westerly winds that blow across the Tasman Sea. As a consequence, moist air blowing with the prevailing winds will almost immediately hit the southern Alps, which will form clouds that dump a torrential amount of rainfall all across the narrow western coastal strip. But as the winds travel further over the mountains, they lose their moisture and get warmer as they cross over and then descend towards the mountain's eastern side, where they then become hot and dry winds that blow across the island's eastern side. As a result, not only do the mountains on the south side take up a lot more of the available space from development, but they also cast a deep rain shadow across the flat plains of the island's western half and turn the eastern half into arid plains. It often subjugates them to drought-like conditions, so essentially land on the eastern side of the island is generally flatter and easier to develop, but it also receives too little rainfall to make growing crops a sustainable venture, while the western side of the island is extremely rugged with far less available flat space and probably too much rain. Conversely, while still fairly mountainous in its own right, the North Island is a lot less mountainous than the South Island is. There's a lot more available flat land that's easier to develop. Rainfall across the Northern Island is also more evenly distributed and predictable than on the South Island, since there aren't as many big mountains to disrupt weather patterns. And since New Zealand is in the southern hemisphere and the North Island is further north closer to the equator, especially extending into the isthmus where Auckland is located, temperatures on the North Island are warmer on average than further down in the south closer to the pole. Also, the North Island has some active volcanoes which have erupted from time to time over the past several decades, thus producing a limited amount of fertile volcanic soils on the island that are completely absent down on the South Island altogether. Based on these factors, New Zealand is simply not a very good choice for commercial crop growing. Less than 2% of the country's total landmass is considered arable and suitable for crop cultivation, a percentage that is comparable to countries like Jordan and Somalia, which each exist largely in a much more hostile desert environment. To make up for the lack of arable land, New Zealand focuses on breeding animals. Over the years, New Zealand brought in a ton of cows and sheep and built its entire agricultural industry off of animals instead. Today, there are nearly 27 million sheep on the islands in comparison to just 5 million humans. With sheep, New Zealand found its perfect niche in the world market because they are now the #1 exporter of sheep products like wool and mutton in the world. Besides, New Zealand also has more than twice as many cows on their islands as they do people, and so it's dairy products that they produce from all these cows that make up for their single largest export. So, despite only 2% of their land being considered arable, 55% of New Zealand's land is still being used for agriculture indirectly. New Zealand's very limited ability to grow crops and remoteness from the rest of the world has ensured that despite their large geographic size, the islands would always have a fairly small population, and a small population plus a very far distance away from the primary 3 global consumer markets in Europe, East Asia and North America meant that New Zealand would never be able to develop a competitive manufacturing sector like happened in other island states like Japan and the United Kingdom, and is likely going to remain that way for years to come. That's all for this video, hope you enjoyed watching this one. Thanks for watching and we'll see you in the next one.